Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The pro-Brexit campaign donor Arron Banks has made a U-turn and agreed to give evidence to the Commons Fake News Select Committee on Tuesday. This comes after claims in the Sunday Times that the businessman met the Russian ambassador to the UK 3 times before the EU referendum. Mr Banks has called the report a convenient political witch hunt.
In other news today, and the founder of Brexit campaign group Leave.EU, Arron Banks, will face questions from MPs amid claims he had contact with Russian officials. Joining us now is the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, Damon Collins, who's in South London. Very good afternoon to you, Mr Collins. Thanks for joining us today. What questions will MPs be asking Mr Banks this week?
Well, I think following the revelations in the newspapers today, we want to understand more about his links to Russia, and in particular, the business deals that may have occurred as a consequence of those meetings. We know meetings seem to have been set up to discuss investment opportunities for him in gold mines and other ventures in Russia. Well, did anything come of that? If Mr Banks profited from his relationship with the Russian embassy through those deals, what happened to that money? Could that money have helped indirectly to fund some of his political donations? Mr Banks is a very significant individual because he has donated more money to political campaigns in this country, £12 million of it, than any other individual. And obviously his donations were a substantial part of the funding of the campaign to leave the EU.
Is there any suggestion that he's done anything wrong because he is a private businessman, he is entitled to pursue private business interests?
That's quite right, and that's why I think we want to know more about the nature of these meetings, what was discussed, the nature of his contact with the Russian embassy, and did it include other meetings, other contact points, was other information shared? I think that's what we want to understand more of. No one's saying having a meeting with the Russian embassy is an offence, but Russia is not a friendly country. Russia has a track record of interfering in the politics of other countries, directly and indirectly. And Mr Banks has given a huge amount of money to political campaigns in this country, and therefore I think it is significant, and I think we have a right to ask more questions about it. We're told that there are thousands of emails.
Sorry, I was going to say, is this not a witch hunt instigated by Remainers?
Not at all, no. This is, I think, really important for us to understand why someone like Mr Banks had this level of contact with the Russian government, maybe more of it, a contact that he'd not denied having, but certainly downplayed the number of times he'd met with them and the significance of those meetings. That he's also someone who has contact with people who were close to Donald Trump and his transition team and campaign team as well. This is information that has only just been disclosed, and I think it's perfectly right that we ask questions about that so we can understand more about the level of his contact and what that contact meant.
If he is vague with his answers or MPs aren't happy with the answers that they are given, what happens next?
Well, that's for the committee to determine. This is part of an inquiry, so we'll be making recommendations in our report and giving a view on the evidence we've received. But I think what would be most helpful now would be if there was disclosure of these emails that have been discussed. We're told there are thousands of them, only probably a relatively small number have so far been published, but it'd certainly be very helpful for us to be able to question Mr Banks based on knowing more about what was in the emails themselves.
Very important week for the Prime Minister. A number of votes are going to the House of Commons this week. Do you think the Prime Minister can keep control of her rebels?
I think the government will be successful in the debates and votes on the amendments this week. These are very, very serious matters. I think as the EU withdrawal bill completes its stages through Parliament, it's important that we have that legislation in place. It is the sort of bedrock on which the Brexit negotiation can be negotiated and then implemented. There's been a lot of discussion in the Commons about these issues already. This bill has already been through all its common stages. We're now debating Lord's amendments, and whilst there are a number of them, the Lord's amendments really do touch on issues that have already been covered off in the House of Commons. So whilst when you're governing without a majority, you can take no vote for granted, particularly on something as controversial as this, I think we'll be successful.
Mr Collins, thank you for your time.
Shahab, we've been rather spoilt for popcorn moments in Parliament over the past few weeks. Looks like we've got another one pending. Arron Banks, something of a divisive figure, is going to be speaking to the Commons Committee. What should we expect from that?
Yeah, calling him a divisive figure is probably an understatement. This is one of the most controversial men in British politics, if you can say he's a member of the political establishment, that we've seen in a very long period of time. The allegations that have come out today that links him to Russian interference with Brexit are extraordinary. But I think there's two really key important things that we need to understand. The first one is that the allegations actually claim that he was involved in some sort of investments with some Russian gold mines or was considering investments. There is nothing wrong with that. I mean, he's a British businessman. He is free to do as he pleases. But the thing that people are pinning this down on is this idea that it had some sort of involvement with Leave.EU, and it also worked as this sort of back door into Donald Trump, and that Arron Banks was used to provide contacts. Now, we don't know for sure whether that's the case, but what is very clear is that Russia has an incentive to destabilise what is going on in the European Union. That's why, from what we understand, they were very keen for Brexit. They're very keen for Donald Trump because that also destabilises the world liberal order, which is what we've seen at the G7 meeting. There is an incentive there for Russia to work against Britain's interests, and it is, as described in the Sunday Times, a bit of a Wally move to go out there and meet with people when you know that's what their incentives are likely to be.
Still, Katie, I suppose for those who want to get to the bottom of what, if any, links there were between the Leave campaign and the Kremlin, is that, you know, as some have already done this morning, they can dismiss the story as, you know, Ramona's Ramoning.
I think some people want to do that. I think there's been so much Russian allegations and efforts to look for links that sometimes people just roll their eyes when it's mentioned as a topic, as in America. But I think there are some serious questions that need to be answered. But I also think that, although we don't know the ins and outs of this, but there's also a point that Leave.EU were not the official Leave group. There was Vote Leave. So even if there are some problems there, and I think there are questions that Arron Banks and co will need to answer, that is not associated with the official Leave campaign.
Katie Balls, Shahab Khan, lovely to see you both. Thanks for joining us.
The prominent Brexit campaigner Arron Banks is described as total garbage. Allegations he received Russian money or support during the EU referendum. The Sunday Times says Mr. Banks had more meetings with Russian officials than he'd previously admitted, raising questions about whether the Kremlin sought to influence the outcome of the Brexit vote. He's agreed to answer questions from a panel of MPs next week.
Now, the millionaire businessman who campaigned and donated to the Brexit campaign is to appear before MPs on Tuesday to explain claims he held undisclosed meetings with Russian officials before the EU referendum. Details of the alleged meetings, contained in emails published by the Sunday Times, come amid questions about possible Russian influence over the UK's vote to leave the European Union. But Arron Banks, who founded Leave.EU, says he's the victim of a political witch hunt. Jane Dodge reports.
He's called himself one of the bad boys of Brexit. But just what has he been up to? Did Arron Banks, Brexit's biggest donor, get money from the Russians to help persuade voters to leave the EU? He strongly denies this. The millionaire businessman and founder of Leave.EU originally admitted to meeting the Russian ambassador once in 2015. But the Sunday Times claims he and his colleague Andy Wigmore had 3 meetings and discussed a business deal involving Russian gold mines. The paper claims emails from Arron Banks and Andy Wigmore show that a suspected Russian intelligence officer, Alexander Udod, who's since been expelled from the UK over the poisoning of the Skripals, introduced them to the Russian ambassador, Alexander Yakovenko. The paper says on the 6th of November in 2015, there was a meeting described as a boozy 6-hour lunch where Brexit, Trump and a deal involving Russian gold mines were discussed. On the 17th of November, Banks met the ambassador again over a cup of tea to discuss the gold mine deal. The third meeting was a year later, where it's claimed Banks gave the Russians the phone numbers of Trump's team. Arron Banks does have links with Russia. His wife's from there. But he's dismissed the meetings he had with the Russian ambassador as 2 boozy lunches and another cup of tea, and says he didn't profit from any business deals because he never pursued anything.
Well, look, I think Brexit was obviously discussed at the lunch. The ambassador was very interested in it. From our perspective, he thought it was highly unlikely Brexit was going to occur, that we were almost wasting our time, but he had an interest in it. Certainly we received no money from Russia, it's just salacious rubbish. And I think from the point of view of why did we say we only had one lunch. Well, I wrote about it in my book. And actually, we had a second lunch after we met Trump and discussed the Trump campaign. He was interested.
Nigel Farage says he knew about one of the meetings because he was invited, but decided not to go.
There's nothing I can see in these newspapers that suggests for one moment that anything Arron Banks has done with Russians had any influence over the referendum whatsoever.
That's not how the Tory MP Damon Collins sees it. His committee will hear evidence from Mr Banks on Tuesday.
If there's a Russian connection to a very wealthy businessman in this country who's given millions of pounds of money to support campaigns like Leave.EU and support the Brexit referendum, if he was profiting from deals that he'd done with the Russian government, I think we have a right to know about that.
In the past, Mr Banks's critics have compared him to a James Bond villain.
I don't have a white cat. I do have a diamond mine, but...
You've got a white bunny?
I've got a white bunny. He's got his feet up.
Mr Banks might be dismissive of his critics, but more revelations are expected in the next few days.
Well, our political correspondent Michael Crick joins me now. Michael, what do you make of all this?
Well, it all depends what happens in the next couple of days, really. Mr Banks and his colleague Andy Wigmore are going before the Culture and Media Select Committee on Tuesday. And Damon Collins, the chairman of the committee, says he's expecting a lot more information before Tuesday's meeting. And indeed, Chris Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, he with the pink hair, has tweeted today that he's already given information to MI5 and the National Crime Agency about dealings between leading Brexit campaigners and the Russian embassy, and that he's now going to provide more information to the Select Committee. So the problem could be for the committee is digesting all that information. The big question, of course, is did the Russians help fund the Brexit campaign in any way? Now, nobody's suggesting the ambassador handed over a big cheque to Arron Banks or anybody else. The suggestion of the Sunday Times articles and the Observer is that somehow they may have been backdoor funding through offering lucrative trade deals. The one trade deal that has been mentioned, the investment in gold mines, well, that fell through. No other idea of any deal has come up, and indeed Arron Banks and Andy Wigmore vehemently deny there was any such arrangement.
And the Americans are pretty interested in all this too, aren't they?
Bound to be. Robert Mueller, the investigator looking into the links between Trump and the Russians during the presidential election campaign, will be interested in congressional inquiries as well, to ask whether it's possible that Banks and Wigmore and maybe Nigel Farage as well were somehow another backdoor conduit between Trump and the Russians. Intriguing is, though, that Banks says he handed over to Russian officials telephone numbers for members of the Trump transitional team. Now, I would have thought the Russians already had such numbers. If they didn't, that rather suggests the links between Trump and the Russians may not have been that great.
Michael, thanks very much. And, of course, you'll be watching like a hawk too, won't you?
Here, the businessman who bankrolled Nigel Farage's Brexit campaigns told ITV News Russia had no part in funding the Leave.EU group. Arron Banks says he is the victim of a witch hunt after details of his connections with the Kremlin became clearer today. Here's our political reporter, Daniel Hewitt.
Has Arron Banks, the self-styled bad boy of Brexit, been up to no good with Russian officials? That's the claim facing the millionaire businessman who backed Nigel Farage's unofficial Leave campaign, a claim he flatly denies.
It's like the Salem witch hunt. You know, there's a witch, there's a witch. And effectively, from our point of view, it's nothing more than, you know, circulating tittle-tattle in an attempt to discredit the campaign.
The man who celebrated with Donald Trump after winning the White House is now being asked questions about his Kremlin connections in the months leading up to the EU referendum. He previously admitted to having a boozy lunch with the Russian ambassador to the UK on November the 6th, 2015. But new emails suggest he met the ambassador and a Russian businessman for a cup of tea 11 days later. In February, he went to Russia with his wife on holiday, and after Trump's victory, he met the ambassador for a third time.
Brexit was obviously discussed at the lunch. The ambassador was very interested in it. From our perspective, he thought it was highly unlikely Brexit was going to occur, that we were almost wasting our time, but he had an interest in it. Certainly we received no money from Russia, it's just salacious rubbish.
Nigel Farage, meanwhile, says he declined the invitation for lunch with the Russian ambassador, but defended Mr Banks.
There's nothing I can see in these newspapers that suggests for one moment that anything Arron Banks has done with Russians had any influence over the referendum whatsoever.
But the MP investigating that very subject isn't so sure.
If Arron Banks and the Russian embassy were having frequent meetings during the referendum period, people will want to know what they were discussing.
Tonight there are MPs here in Westminster calling for a criminal investigation into Arron Banks' Kremlin connections. But he remains bullish, telling ITV News there should be a full judge-led inquiry into the whole issue of Russian interference in British politics. His message to them: bring it on. Daniel Hewitt, ITV News in Westminster.